everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you for sitting close, because I would have invited you to do so. If you have one of these, if you can turn it off, I only say that because I was the most recent offender at a recent event where, and I don't have one of the crazy ringtones, but any ringtone is a drag in the middle of the talk. I just want to mention a couple of events before I introduce Sid. Sidney Lee, I should have said that properly. This coming Saturday, December 14th, we have our annual Victorian Holiday event. That'll be upstairs. The Hilltones, the St. Johnsbury Academy Hilltones will be singing. The North Country Youth Chorus will be singing. Bill Tobin will be playing his harp. And in a return to a good tradition, Nat Tripp will be reading from A Child's Christmas in Wales. So that's this Saturday at 1 o'clock. That'll be a lot of fun upstairs. Next Wednesday, I think we're going to do this upstairs as well. That's December 18th from 1 to 2. The Kingdom Mountain Dulcimers will be playing holiday music. And if you haven't heard 8 or 10 people playing dulcimer, it's kind of trippy. And it's a very nice sound. And they play traditional tunes. There's no singing, so there's no off-key singing. It's a really lovely event. I should properly, it's a great thing. That's that's Wednesday, December 18th. And I want to thank Scott Beck, who is here, and Joelle Beck. They are handling book sales tonight from Boxcar and Caboose right here in town. Shop locally. It really doesn't matter. Something like 75 cents of your dollar stays right here, wherever local is, when you shop locally. And thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. Thanks to Joelle, too. Now I want to introduce Sidney Lee. And I was saying to Sidney, it's a little bit of a longer introduction, but he is such an accomplished person that once in a while you should have somebody just read it straight out. And this is a baby version, even though it's long.
I wrote it all in.
You're a great writer. Here, this book is Sid's 13th book of poetry. He has published numerous books in multiple genres, among them Pursuit of a Wound, which was a finalist for the 2001 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. He is the founder of New England Review and has been awarded Rockefeller, Fulbright, and Guggenheim fellowships. He has taught at Dartmouth, Yale, Wesleyan, Vermont, and Middlebury colleges, as well as at Switzerland's Franklin College and Budapest's National Hungarian University. His stories, poems, essays, and criticism have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The New York Times, Sports Illustrated, and many other periodicals, as well as in more than 50 anthologies. He lives in Newbury, Vermont, with his wife Robin, who is here with us as well. And he is active in both community literacy efforts and in environmental conservation. I was reading this earlier and I kept saying environmental conversation. That is something Sid also does, but that's environmental conservation. One site says you help conserve thousands, tens of thousands of acres of land in Maine. It seems like a really admirable feat. He has been described as a man in the woods with his head full of books and a man in books with his head full of woods. Please join me in welcoming Sidney Lee.
Thank you, Bob. Every time I hear that man in the woods, etc., I'm reminded of my late poet friend Bill Matthews' synopsis of my work. He said it could be summed up in a line from the Teddy Bear's Picnic. He said, if you go down to the woods today, you're in for a big surprise. Could be worse, I suppose. At any rate, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Bob, and thanks for coming. I had a little twinge of nostalgia when Bob mentioned the Hilltones, because our youngest was a star of the Hilltones, if I do say so. A wonderful, wonderful singer and a wonderful poet as well. Miss her. She lives out in Oakland, and she likes it way too much for my taste. But at any rate, I'm going to read it really exclusively from this new book called Here. Maybe I'll save the backstory on it, the way it was organized for a little bit later on. But I did notice in putting it together, and especially before, when I was about halfway through and I had a certain number of poems amassed, I noticed how much of the content had to do with here-ness, with physical presence. Well, I'll go on. I mean, and in 2016, much to my surprise, I had a heart attack. Well, most people don't anticipate that sort of thing. And thereafter, here-ness became acutely precious to me. Great English critic Samuel Johnson, in a kind of an analogous comment, said the prospect of the gallows concentrates the mind wonderfully. I became ever more grateful for being here. I'm sure that had it not been for, it's easy for me to get on about the good old days, but I'm sure that what killed my father at 55 is what would have killed me if we hadn't had the medical technology that we now do have. So I needn't get too sentimental about how wonderful things once were, however awful they seem at the present moment, on which more directly. At any rate, the first poem is called Here at Summer's End. The birds have largely quieted may distress us, and like neglected mail, the garden's lettuce went yellow weeks back, then simply dissolved. But we ought to pause before we focus on loss, and the season still teeming with vegetation. No matter the month, our sense of wonder remains, unless we will it to leave. Even now, the mercury flirts with 85, so it's wondrous, say, how starlings decide to convene for migration. We can watch their flocks in the roadbeds. It's a marvel as well, whatever the force is that's already started to blanch the legs of the snowshoe hares. Our longing is always for now to endure, though since the dawn of thinking, many a thinker has found death an engine of beauty. Truth is, however, our world will never go dead. Those heads of lettuce have fused with humus below, and after those starlings wing off, the juncos and titmice will show, and the ghostly hares of winter won't be ghosts at all, but creatures with dark flesh packed onto bone under ivory hide. Coyotes will hunt them to keep alive through the ineluctable, I almost said awful, chill. And even then, the ice beads on softwoods' boughs may look, if we want, like permitted fruit. As a season nears or lingers or ends, an amplitude can tell us we still are subject to spells. We're here, after all. Let's chant it throughout the year, like so much bird song. We're here, we're here, we're here, we're here. This poem is called Spilled Milk, and it's described in a little inscription as an apology to a daughter almost 40 years late. The train lumbered out of Toronto Station. Together, we headed for subarctic lakes to visit your brother at camp, your older and only sibling then. I dreamed of northern air as our coach careens past clinkers, barrels, filthy railway sheds, ugly as you were lovely. I ordered a spread of lunchtime stuff, with me some coffee and a glass of milk for you. A dozen miles would pass before you took a drink. You had a habit, almost willful it seemed, of spilling whatever you drank, and must have been afraid, damn it, to reach for your glass while the dining car swayed and quivered. As for me, distracted, I was fixed on the winking waters we'd find upstream from the mess of Milky River at trackside. In time, we escaped those outskirts into open prairie space, and you spilled the glass, of course. I pray at least I said nothing out loud, but I have no doubt you could read my miserable thoughts. And now, if I get to hell, as I sometimes think I will if justice prevails, precisely for things I've thought, my Hadean vision may be of your shame-ridden 6-year-old face, all riven by worry, which it should have been my fatherly duty to soothe, restoring what had been its beauty. I came within an ace of being born in the state of Alabama, which, if you remember your Sharpie lesson, was lately ravaged by hurricanes. At any rate, the reason I didn't get born there is explained in this little story called The Owl and I. Once the Jim Crack, I should preface this by saying that, well, it's in the poem. Once the Jim Crack cross got burned on our lawn, my mother took off back north to heaven. My father was stationed in Gadsden, Alabama before the Second Great War, commander of so-called colored troops. And he'd invited a few of the men inside the house, it seems. A radical thing indeed just then in the heart of Jim Crow Dixie. So my mother escaped giving birth down there, though I don't have any idea why I'd think of this, which, near to her death, she spoke of so many years after. Why now, on watching a barred owl glide to a hemlock gone dark at sundown, everything else is well going dark around me here where I stand. Once, at midnight, she thought she'd heard a whoop of human anguish and wondered whether some soldier were being lynched outside. My father went for a look but found nothing. My lifelong relations with my mother were vexed, I now suspect, in part because between us two stood a lot in common. The Jews were being crammed into cattle cars then, but for Dad and those troops, the evil in Europe lay several months ahead. Still, real or imagined, that cry of mortal misery stuck with my mother. Though no signs of nearby violence turned up next morning, the company came en masse to mess, shit on a shingle as the GIs shed, dried beef on toast. So life went on, at least for a while, more or less. It ought to bring comfort that I'm where I am, aging but safe, my kin constantly swelling as sons and daughters produce their sons and daughters. And winter, so harsh this year, giving way at last to spring, with snowdrops glinting, the freshets making their evanescent cascades through the woods. I recall how Mother loved this season. Why then this lonely sensation? It feels that I'm in some pitch-black tunnel and won't get out again. That this, as the saying goes, is it. That all I'll have at the end, of course there can't be anything in it, is the sorrowful 8-note anthem of that single owl, the sound just now having reached my vexed old head, though I'd be foolish to think that song was addressed to anyone human. I don't know if others, well, probably you did. When I was younger, I had this fantasy that I would try and do things that I imagined had never, ever been done before in human history and never would be again, and which drove me into some pretty bizarre behavior, some of which is described in this poem, which is called What's to be Expected. This is true. It's a little embarrassing, but anyway, what's to be expected? One evening before youth fellowship, I found some organ pipes on the floor and knelt beside them, singing Long Tall Sally into one. Meanwhile, I signed my name with a finger in the dust of the nubbly concrete. No one had ever done these things all at once, and no one ever would. That was a fusty basement room in St. Paul's. Why this recollection on the bank of a brook? Less strange to remember a poem by Robert Frost, whose brook runs out of song and speed come June. The one I stand beside has never sung, has never run. It barely crawls at ice out, and by now, mid-May, its water has seeped to nothing. What's new? Not much. It does this every year. Snow melts, the freshets goat it, then it dies. The barn opposed across the way, but enough of frost. Irrelevant here, where a barn is crumbling in that field of weeds. It needs refurbishment that it won't get. The sills are rotted, walls all splayed like a doomed doe's legs on ice. Did someone stand on the earthen ramp with a golf club? Unlikely. So how on earth did that dimpled ball, egg-like below me, land in its nest of dried algae? Nothing's to be expected or ever was. Consider any two people supposedly normal and prepare yourselves to hear of odd behavior. One may raise chinchillas, one loves tango. We wonder who'd expect it. Answer, no one. I labored to be unique when I was young, but what of my uncle, who listened to the ring of the Nibelung while plucking his geese for the larder? It was just what he did, not striving to be eccentric. His brother, my father, served a tough stint in the Army, European theater, World War II. So why did he love to sing old Navy tunes? Search me. Search him. He much preferred freshwater. I smell his bay rum now as I recall him and contemplate a ball in withered muck and note a certain barn, gap-toothed, neglected, and conjure Robert Frost, great local author, and remember an uncle, a basement, Little Richard. Now what, I ask you? What's to be expected? Many years ago, I'm trying to think, maybe 51 years ago, that area in Maine that Bob referred to as a long generational relationship to that little part of the world in Washington County, Maine, on the New Brunswick border. And I was out in a canoe and I saw a forest fire suddenly erupt from nowhere, it seemed. And we don't have those kinds of fires anymore in the east. Maybe we rake better than they do out west. I don't know. I can't help it. I keep thinking of it. You can't make this stuff up anyway. But that's actually because of better surveillance and better firefighting equipment. But in those days, you know, a fire would start and it would burn all through the warm months until the snow came, and because it would keep going along in the duff and dust and break out here. There was a great old character up there named George MacArthur who told me that during the Depression one broke out, and when they had it under control, he was hired by the local fire warden, who also ran the general store, to keep an eye on it, you know, because it was right close to town. And he told me that times were kind of tough, and he said, you know, if you could afford just a little jug of coal oil, you could keep the thing going all summer, which he was able to do. At any rate, this is a poem in response to a recollection of a big fire in that part of the world. Fire in Jewel. 80-foot hemlock, spruce, fir, pine, they kept lifting off their stumps like so many rockets. Smoke trails and all, and I beheld the fire cross lake from where I drifted. I'd been plumbing the water for fish when my eyes were lifted. 50 years later, I still recall my thoughts and how I felt that to think them was more than odd. I was glad I had faculties to behold the hill's astounding orange heat as it flared to white with each explosion. Then the whole of the conflagration bending toward earth, a horizontal wall, a monolith that somehow tore downhill in a sudden fury of wind. It was gorgeous. Several hours would go by till I learned Earl Bailey was forced to fly as quickly as he could on his dozer down from the ridge right into Farm Cove. He just had to take the loss. It was that or burn. Donald Chambers, wielding an axe in his turn with a makeshift crew, collapsed from labor and heat. Paul, the storekeeper, dragged him away. I knew Don, sadly, just a few more years. He and Earl and Paul, good, honest men. I can't account for dreams like the one last night when I watched that fire again, in what seemed again pure quiet, serene. The same jetliner as years ago crossing high, the same scent rose, torched needles, caustic smoke. The same evil roar came on as I rocked in the same canoe, the waves still slapping its hull. In an hour, 5 decades back, the length of that ridgeline turned the color of onyx. The latest of my wife's birthdays will soon be upon us. Is that why the dream passes smoothly into the next one? I saw precisely a beautiful onyx stone, hung on her breast from a slip of chain. I'd never dreamt such a woman as that hillside blackened. Wouldn't meet her for years. Today, I drove to a jewelry shop as if still dreaming. 300 miles to the west of that little mountain, I bought the necklace and felt some fire in my being, mild version of one that kindled in that old autumn, which has, for a long time, underground, kept burning. As long as we're talking about fire, this poem I wrote many, many, many years ago. And it wasn't any good, and maybe it still isn't, but I rediscovered it as I was sweeping out the Augean stables that I refer to as my office. And I thought, well, there's something there that I wanted to see if I could return to and do a better job on, and this is called Auction. If I passed their sway-backed house on a summer day, like anyone in town, I'd hear Fred scraping at his cherished rosewood fiddle, which is now just char. Hazel would be singing no better than her husband played. Neither one cared. They made their music for fun, and I made fun of them both. Then came fire. I feel odd guilt to consider their frailty, and I wonder, what am I here to see? Out of nowhere, I think of an early love, and how often I laughed at her dreams of being a painter, at what she hoped but was simply unable to save with shapes on canvas and colors. Of course, she left me. My life has been more capacious than I deserved, but in those days, her loss kept scorching my soul. I was all but speechless. She later died of an illness, horribly, young. I reflect that after her fire for me had cooled and soon, in fact, simply gutted, I sometimes wished catastrophe would strike her. Fred and Hazel reduced to cinder. That was a shock and a shame. But more vanished too, some even beforehand. The children they bred in that old house had moved off years back, though they've come today to reap what little they may. Their son and two daughters are here. Unlike the initial silverware, the tunes we mocked, crude watercolors spread wrought of sunsets, snowstorms, birds, old barns, and deer. Hazel's antimacassars, black wisps on blackened couch and chair. Old photographs of his parents and hers, long gone, now gone again. And again, I'm thinking of goneness. The way my lover would dip the brush in paint and scowl as if in pain. Here, so little remains to sell, it's absurd. The auctioneer stumbles, searching for words. Well, just to prove I'm lots of fun in real life, I'll read this poem called All Hallows Eve. It was prompted by, remembering a photograph that our oldest daughter sent of her twin children dressed up for Halloween, All Hallows Eve. I hollow my body out before bed. Context, partial denture, hearing aids, blurry-eyed, gap-toothed, aching, and hard of hearing. Again, I thank an unnameable something for what I have. However dim in my sight it may be, the water in our pond downhill still reaps the burnish of the rough-edged moon that winks through the same old window tree. Remarkably, like a pack of dogs, between the ridges that make a frame for our same old house, the barred owls yammer. Downstairs are 3 real dogs, snuff and twitch and dream. One child's out west, and how I pray she doesn't love it. I love her and the other 6 who live nearby. No doubt their children trick or treat. At last, before I lay me down, I attempt some reassembly. 2 wrist braces for carpal tunnel, collar pillow, CPAP mask, lest tonight be the one when I breathe my last. like a jack-o'-lantern, that ghostly creature grins ear to ear in the dresser mirror. Well, no, we don't have 6 children. I don't know how that got in there. At the time that the poem was composed, we had 6 grandchildren, and now 7, and I think I got mixed up. You know. At any rate, we have 5. That's enough, quite enough. But after you've all patronized Boxcar and Caboose, there could be a second print run, and we'll get that fixed out. How many people remember Studebakers? Some people, when they smell ragweed, sneeze, and I sometimes I have to tell stories. I can't help it. Mostly, I'm happy to say, they're self-effacing or self-mocking. This one is extraordinary, if I do say so. It was a miraculous thing that happened again when I was a young fellow. I went to see a movie called Wee Geordie. Now, has anybody ever seen Wee Geordie? Well, it was a story about a Highland farmer who was preparing for the Highland Games. And his event was what we used to call throwing the hammer, and they now call it throwing the 35-pound weight. And it's a great, you know, and they go around and around and around and fling it. So I went, and he wins the event and gets the girl and the whole, you know, the usual thing. So I got home and I got directly to the tool shed. I said, we got to try this out. Well, I tried it probably a dozen times and threw it as far as perhaps from me to you, Tim. And so I was about to give up. I said, I give it one more try. Maybe my technique was not right. And I couldn't do this again, even, you know, when I was at my most robust in my 30s or whatever. But all of a sudden I did it, and out it went, just as a Studebaker was driving down the road by our house. And the whole thing was like a slow-motion movie in my mind. This guy's driving along just as innocently as could be. And happily, it did not land on the windshield, but it did land right on the roof of his car, which occasioned him to, fortunately, there was no traffic on that little road, except for my father, who was coming home from work at exactly that time with a little blue Volkswagen. He stopped and you get in the house. Well, I was more than happy to do that, so in I went. And I don't know what kind of negotiation went on between him and the Studebaker jockey, but not too long after he came into the house, and he was just such a sweet man anyway. He tried to get really stern with me, and as he began to chew me out, I could see he was fighting back laughter. So I was never adequately punished. It really has almost nothing to do with this poem, except there is a Studebaker. Stick season. The one that precedes my season is the one that always shows in those quaint calendar photographs. The one that brings the tourist to scenes that are glorious, granted, exorbitant on the side hills. Most of the leaves incandescent, drifting or plunging downward to scuttle along the roadbeds like little creatures reluctant to be seen, yet wanting us to notice them after all. But give me this, middle November, season of sticks, of stubborn oak and beech leaves, umber and dun, which rattle and gust the smell so elemental they stab your heart. The trees, the other unclothed ones, are standing there, gaunt but dignified, and you can look straight through them to the contours of the mountains, stark perhaps, lovely, in their apparent constancy. That gap-toothed barn houses space alone since its owner died. You remember Studebakers? That's one over there, a pickup truck, flat-footed among the sumacs, painted green way back. These days it has taken the hue of these later leaves I love. Old age has changed the mountains too. They're rounder now than once, shaped so by the eon. Everything's for a time. The second youngest of our grandchildren, because we now have one that's 11 months. This one is 4, but I conceived this poem one day when we were giving his parents a break. Everybody who's been a parent knows that he or she can use that occasionally. Although this is the sweetest, easiest little guy to deal with anybody has ever had anything to do with, I must say. And one of my favorite, now if you told me this when I was in my 20s and kind of ripping and running, that grandparenthood would be one of the chief joys of my stay here on this, in this mortal coil, I probably would have, well, I definitely would have thought you were probably wrong, but you would have been right. And one of my favorite things is to fall asleep with a little child on my chest. And this is called a grandson sleeps on my chest. The thread of drool from his lip to my shirt shows lovely, prismatic, refracting the beams of this fine, warm April sun as I loll on a couch. Those colors won't blend with the song from the classic country station I just tuned in. Hank Williams is just so lonely, damn near killed. There's a dog asleep, too, in a circle of light on the rug near a pair of rattles, teething ring, and a bear that his late great-grandmother made my hand years back for this sweet child's father. Oh, I could get going on how that father, our son, has become such a good big man. When only yesterday, as the cliche has it, I held him just this way. Oh, I could get going all right about the absence of the sweet-mannered woman who fashioned the bear, twice the size of this boy in my arms. I could fret again that maybe I've come up short as man or parent or husband. But no, I won't be going that way, or those. Hank's midnight train is winding low, while here, I hear only lyrical breathing and the odd and oddly comical infant gurgle. A scent from the grandson's crown wafts up. And that's when all preachments waft up too, all vanities, worries, to die their sudden death. A lot of these memories of how dumb one was as a boy, which I hope to have been dumb at one time in one's life. It's forgivable. It better be. This poem is called Snapper. It seems a greater wonder that I should have made it through my boyhood years than that lone dark snapper who skulked in my uncle's spring house survived as well. I tried to blow his head off all one summer, my puny 22 wild bullets glancing from his carapace and then zing, zing off water, steel, and stone. A turtle may well have been 80. Those old pirates lived for ages and ages. From the pterodactyl's time, the race has lingered. I was 12 or 13 myself. You can't die either if you're that young, no more than your mother or father. Extinction in some faraway nation that no one visits. For convenience, I'll call the snapper him hereafter. This one's mate or mates dwelled somewhere else. In June, those females often laid their eggs in the gravel bank on the other side of the pond. But they could have done so any time of year before hard frost. At length, their tiny spawn would shuck their shells and scrabble for open water. Most were doubtless gobbled up by coon or fox or mink or crow or dog or heron. As for me back then, it was righteousness I aimed at. I never thought of my quarry as something I'd eat. And I never wondered where that quarry might go come dead of winter. By then, my play had ceased. I was stuck at school where Johnny Silver ruled. He bounced dirt clods or snowballs off my body at every recess. All I could do was flee him or try to hide until I heard the bell. I didn't visit the spring house in that season. That was homework, nightly, noisy, clownish suppers, awakening of pubescence's unreason, awkwardness of unfamiliar lust. I'd come now and then on snappers up on land, bumbling, clumsy. But I was disinclined to shoot them there, though I took mean joy in teasing hisses from them with whatever I could find. I remember once breaking the shaft of a broom I wielded, but I knew he'd never catch me if he tried. Snapping turtles slower than slow on ground. Yet his normal heart rate is 200 beats a minute. Until, that is, he sinks into mud for winter. Then the rate astoundingly drops to 2 a day. He endures on body fat alone, the snapper, staving off acidosis by the leaching of carbonates from his shell. He's simply a wonder. It doesn't matter what we humans think, whether he strikes us as loathsome as he did me. When to murder one seemed a noble thing to do, a little part I could play in the world of salvation. This much later, I wince at the nightly news. I see beheading. I hear unmanned bombers sent to crush what the second Bush, that fool, described as evildoers. We know we're righteous and feel free, therefore, to eradicate whole towns as surely as predators ravage newborn snappers. I somehow survived. I never shot myself, no more than I shot a slug through that quiet glider, the one who haunted my uncle's springhouse waters, who, in my childish eye, embodied evil, and whom, though I didn't know it, I risked my life for. Stoicism. Through a frost-flowered pane, I watch his truck disappear. Sole moving thing in a wide tableau, so still with cold, it might be an abstract painting, white on white. And under that pall, hunkered in terror, small, harmless creatures seek cover from ravening foes. The huge man gulped his coffee, then he scampered from our wood-warmed kitchen. He's here for a week, while he takes a course not far from his childhood raising. He dare not be late. He'll soon be a wilderness first responder, and that description. That son has always been quick to ease whatever pain he can in others. As for me, when the same week's end arrives, I take one more step from 70 toward my 80s. Should I celebrate? Until then, our son will train in weather stalled for some time at 0 degrees or just shy. I can't hide, of course, from predator age forever. Nobody does, I remind myself. The fact that I've survived this long is maybe no more than fate. My father fell and one of my brothers too young. I picture our child knee-deep in drifts for hours today. He'll study life-saving measures against near drownings, cuts to the bone, hypothermia, ski crashes, shivered limbs. How the hours have raced since he, blonde boy in grass-stained trousers, tore breathless up from our field that afternoon and into the kitchen with a handful of bluets so tender that before he could bring them inside, they shriveled. "Mom and Dad," he blurted in sheerest delight, his words his fate. "Look what I did. I picked you flowers." If I permit myself so much as a sniffle, just now, the tears behind it will fall for hours. When he was taking that course, he saw some videos by a world-renowned expert in hypothermia. He was a professor at the University of Manitoba, and he gave me the link. And this man, whose name I've forgotten, Dr. Nutt, would enact the scenarios that one was supposed to respond to. For example, he said oftentimes people will go on a snowmobile out on thin ice and fire it up, and out he'd go. And he would say, "Now after 10 minutes, the shivering will stop, at which point you can..." And then he'd just jump into the water. He did all kinds of things that I just become mad scientist on steroids. So I'm sure if you Google it, you can see anything nowadays. Look up a professor from Manitoba enacting hypothermia. It's really worth it. It's absolutely stunning. Here's another sentimental poem from my beloved wife for 40 years, who has kept me from wandering into traffic for all that length of time. It's called Gifts. Some weeks ago, I looked as though sparse snow had fallen in a straight line beside the lane where we walk our dogs. That seemed odd. It was only the year's wild strawberry blossom. Today, that small drift vanished again. The fruit is ready for reaping. But then, how little one gathers for the effort involved. The berries, more whole than meat, are stingy, and my back is creaky, and my fingers are clumsy. When our children were small, they could sometimes be chores. Beautiful chores, but chores nonetheless. Now we'd have them back, they grew up so fast. 10 minutes of picking, scanty harvest. It seems, as my grandmother used to say, not worth the candle, though no candle is called for. The late spring morning, crisp and alive, lit by a thousand greens from the arch of trees. And no matter, I lean a bit at the waist, having stooped to my task for meager reward. When I reach our door, my matchless wife is standing there. My wife, open-eyed, open-armed, at an open door. And I will close with this poem called Here Itself. As I was saying earlier on, and it was a very, that whole heart attack thing was very strange, because I was actually in the process of training for a long flatwater kayak race that I do every year, and feeling better than I ever had. And all of a sudden I had this strange, and I didn't have I had like a 3-minute episode of shortness of breath, but I no pain to speak of, and no pressure, any of the things that you, so I would have ignored it. In fact, I did most of the day. And then, as I was saying, my wife said, given your family history, I think maybe we ought to go have this checked out. And so I went down to this tiny little clinic in Calais, Maine, and the guy gave me a blood test and said, you're having a heart attack. I said, no, I'm not. That happens to other people. That's not me. I'm fine. Then we went down to the Eastern Maine Medical Center in Bangor, which is a terrific facility now, largely thanks to Stephen King, who's just endowed it in all manner of ways, bless his heart. And you don't say anything. The epigraph is from the patient's report that was written on me. Eluting stent placed in occluded right coronary artery of otherwise fit and pleasant 73-year-old male, former Poet Laureate of Vermont. I didn't add the and pleasant. You can read it yourself. I had a heart attack is something I kept on thinking one hears from others. In search of dazzling revelation, I'd wandered blind through the world, had begun to see as much. Having approached Paul's barber shop, for instance, down the same asphalt alley, in the same old hardscrabble hamlet, and through the same old waiting room with those copies unchanging of Guns and Ammo, Popular Mechanics, what have you, I contemplated the ancient jug of Lucky Tiger, Paul's horseshoe pitching trophies, the snapshot curling around its tacks of the 350-pound bear at his feeder, and Paul, and myself, right there in the mirror, as ever. It's 30 years and more he's been cutting my hair as it's dwindled. 3 full decades of identical questions when he's nearing the finish. Or to dry. Shall I do the eyebrows? A little more off the top? Trim the ears? Of course he knows the answers. It's a right is all, and a very comfort. Wonder lies in minuscule things. I'm here. There's a tough, late solitary dahlia in our flower garden. A hooded merganser drake is grating like a rusted hinge from our pond. I notice these things as it seems to me I haven't before. I felt no fear, just wistfulness her wife, children, grandchildren, friends. I had a dress rehearsal for death, but no terror. Strapped to a gurney, I went off to visit the wonderful isthmus it was, the isthmus of forever. An Indian summer paddle trip on my beloved Connecticut River, reflected below, crows across the water to disappear behind a scrim of yellow leaves, cottonwood, silver maple. I can't quite describe it, but here I am to see it. I push through the windrows of lustrous fall foliage on the surface. There, above the village steeple, a cloud resembling nothing, only itself. Not chastity, not purity, cotton, whipped cream, itself. Who'd want it other? I'm here to see it, itself, entire. Well, thank you for hearing me out.